Hi everyone. I am very happy to be here and share my research with you. My name is Kelly Rivera, as I mentioned, and I'm a master's degree candidate for the Master of Arts in Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. And as part of one experiential learning course that I took last summer, I was partnered up with the Cooper Institute, which is an education and community research center where they do research on people on different topics such as migrant workers and the livable income in PEI and in Canada. So our partnership just made sense at the time, and our goal was to create a community report where we would see the results of how the housing crisis affects international students living on Prince Edward Island. So throughout the presentation, you'll also see some illustrations that I created inspired in PEI, because when, for example, for this one, when you arrive in PEI, you'll see red rocks. So your white sneakers will turn pink if you ever visit the island. So I thought it'd be a good way to showcase a little bit of the island if you have never visited before. So on with the show. The introduction part will be mainly what's going on right now on Prince Edward Island as far as this topic goes. So finding housing on Prince Edward Island, it's very difficult right now because of the low vacancy rate and high rent prices, and also the lack of law enforcement of the current policies for tenants, meaning there are policies that in a way are trying to mitigate with this issue, but they're not, there's lack of law enforcement. And also international students who contribute a lot to the island's economy are facing housing challenges living in Charlottetown, which is where two of the main educational institutions are located, which is Holland College and the University of Prince Edward Island, which is where I study. And also a recent report from the city of Charlottetown mentioned that 56% of youth, meaning people from 16 years old to 30 years old, spend a lot more than 30% of their income on just housing. And according to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Association or institution, spending more than 30% of their income on housing, it's not considered affordable. So they found that these people, regardless of their employment, they spend that much on housing, and 58% are not satisfied with their housing conditions, meaning that they're still living with their parents, or they are living with a lot of roommates in a very tiny space. So they're really dissatisfied because of the high costs of housing. And also international students face that additional burden of high tuition fees, because we end up paying 5 times more than Canadian citizens or Canadian students for our education. And this study explores the housing crisis impact on international students, and is aiming to inform policies to address these challenges and improve the low immigrant retention rate on the island, which is like 28%, which is really low compared to the rest of the country. That is, I forgot to mention which illustration. That's the teacup, that two red rocks. It got washed away because of Fiona's hurricane, so you can't see it anymore in person, but it was a really kind of staple of the island. And that one's, I don't know if you read the book Anne of Green Gables. So it's Anne of Green Gables' house, and there's a museum, and you can actually see the house when you visit the island, and a lot of people visit because of that. So you're welcome to visit PEI, and if you're a fan of the book. So on with what I found on other islands and more information about this specific group of immigrants. So a study at the University of Toronto mentioned that financial stress caused severe mental and physical health issues within students, international students, and it's kind of affecting their learning process or their experiences as an international student. So there are also recent reports on depopulation in projections in PEI. And combined with other reports on PEI, the housing crisis is a significant reason for depopulation or population decline, with 68% of students mentioning that like to stay in the island if the housing situation was improved or the housing crisis wasn't so bad. And PEI has fallen behind in affordable housing since 2008. as we can see in Baldacchino's report. He did a report that mentioned at the time, in 2006, people were moving to PEI because of the affordable housing, but now it's not the case. So it's affecting the attraction and retention of immigrants, and also on other islands, and I want to specifically focus also on other subnational island jurisdictions, which is the case of PEI. For example, Scottish Islanders also face depopulation due to a lack of suitable and affordable housing. In the Canary Islands in Spain, the tourist sector increases housing costs, and it makes the crisis a lot more critical. And also housing affordability or availability also fails to meet the local needs in Stockholm, I'm trying to pronounce them really well, Jönköping and Malmö, which are Swedish cities, for example, and also Nunavut in Canada, which it's also a subnational island jurisdiction. They are experiencing a housing crisis, and it's mainly characterized by overcrowding, the poor quality, and the hidden homelessness, which is really bad. And also, according to Baldacchino, as far as subnational island jurisdictions, he mentions that they consist of immigrant societies, which is really true. But he also says that they often benefit from the resources from the mainland. But would they also benefit from those issues that also affect the mainland? Because we know that the housing crisis is affecting the entire country, not just PEI. So we can look at that because, for example, Andrews and Grave Morning in 2006, they did a paper that where they argued that the subnational island jurisdictions hypothesis, where the economic benefits overweigh the challenges of being an island, fails to consider the disparities between indigenous island inhabitants and colonial or even immigrant settled populations. For example, in Corsica and Hawaii, native populations don't equally benefit from the economic advantages caused by tourism. And a recent study in 2021 by Russell and other colleagues highlight that Prince Edward Island depends a lot on national government, like the federal transfers. So it kind of takes away that self-sufficiency, and it also makes them a lot dependent on the federal government. So that it's a lighthouse. You can also find them, a lot of them on the island if you ever visit. So for the methodology on this test study, it was a qualitative phenomenological approach where I interviewed 4 students in about 2 weeks, and I had a very tight deadline, and that's why this is a test study. And as an international student at UPEI, I was aware that I would interview some of my classmates, but when it got to actually create, going through with the research, I didn't interview people that I actually knew, so it worked for that part. And also I used a voice recorder to record all of the interviews and analyze the results and kind of organize the information. And I also created the community report as a result, and I also took an ethics course before doing this because I knew I was interacting with people and kind of in a sensitive situation, so I thought it was important. And so the results were that this test study focused on 4 international students living in Charlottetown and attending the University of Prince Edward Island. I couldn't interview people from Holland College, but I did some observation of 2 Holland College students. I interviewed these people using open-ended questions and closed-ended questions, and it highlighted the significance of these numbers, as 30% of students at UPEI are international students, and that number just keeps increasing every year. So around 80% of international students live in Charlottetown, and among these participants, 3 out of 4 international students felt unsafe in their initial long-term accommodation, and they chose to move out after a month of being there, even despite having paid rent, which is really sad. and most of them struggle financially, with 75% of their income going towards monthly rent payments. And many were unaware of the available free services, such as nonprofits that connect them with potential employers or assist them with their taxes, and provide free resources like furniture, clothes, and food, which says maybe PEI is trying to be more welcoming in that sense, but maybe there's kind of like a lack of that communication strategy. So this is the last slide, and that's the Confederation Bridge, which connects PEI with the rest of the mainland, I guess, and other provinces like the neighboring provinces like Nova Scotia and others. So I think for what I found so far suggests that there's a need for stronger policies and regulations to address the issue of housing unaffordability, particularly from the perspective of newcomers. One recommendation is to establish regulations on international student tuition costs to improve the accessibility. And additionally, there's a lack of investment on social housing, and relying solely on private companies is not okay, because housing needs, it's a need, it's not a luxury, and nonprofits should be supported to ensure long-term, affordable, and safe housing for important groups like international students and our homeless population. And also to address the low vacancy rates, maybe higher taxes on vacation homes and disincentives from home flippers, as well as bans on international buyers, could be implemented and maybe kind of mitigate with this issue. And lastly, raising awareness among the community and about the impact on international students and improving communication strategies for immigrants and students services is crucial, so that PEI actually becomes more welcoming and the current programs or immigration programs that they have actually work and kind of increase our 28% immigrant retention rate. So yeah, this is basically it. This is my presentation on this issue, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will open the floor for questions, and I would like to ask the question first. When I think of the islands that I research, then we also have a housing crisis. These are much more, smaller islands than the one you're looking at here. But the answer to that crisis in Denmark is we need to build more houses, we need to build more homes, and we need to diversify the kinds of homes so that it's not, you're not only a buyer when we move to an island, we should be able to rent a house and so on. But in the meantime, I see second home owners, and in some of the islands that I study, more than 50% of the permanent homes are in second home use. On some islands it's legal, in some other islands it is illegal, but they do it anyway. So what are your reflections on the second home usage? How big is it in Prince Edward Island, and could that be, using your houses wrongly, could that fix this?
Yeah, like I mentioned, maybe putting a higher tax on people that choose to buy other houses additionally to theirs. They usually use it for the purpose of vacation homes, meaning that they only are open in the summer, and there's a lot of that. So international students are not seasonal, and it's one of the biggest immigrant groups that contribute to the economy on the island. So I think putting a regulation on that would eventually be effective, but there's also, I guess, that need or that lack of law enforcement. That there's not, maybe there's like a law, because I have read what they're allowed to do and what not to do. And they shouldn't do that, but there are ways that people find in the island, people find to kind of go over them or what it says, and it's really sad. So I think that could improve things, but also, for example, I saw a project on Montreal, which I think it's also on national island jurisdiction. And what they do is that the university uses part of the, because they get from international students, the part of their tuition. So with that money and also other sources of funding, they were able to create residencies or apartments just for international students or just for students, which that could also help the situation, because we have to keep in mind that the government in PEI only owns 90% of the land. So if they want to contribute to improving this, issue, they would have to buy land from other islanders, and that could maybe not work, because there can be some resistance because it's theirs and all of that. So if the university does it, because they are profiting from international students, that could be a good way. But also, I think keeping in mind that international students, when it comes to renting, they are competing with Canadian citizens, and they don't have the same income, they don't have the same credit score. Once you arrive in Canada, you start from scratch. You don't have more than 600 credit score, and that's one of the things that the landlords look at whenever they choose to keep you as a tenant or not, or get you to rent that. So I think maybe regulations on that sense, like making that difference from Canadian citizens and international students, and also keeping in mind that they can only work 20 hours a week, which is a very low income. I think making that difference could improve things eventually, and hopefully the government is open to that. They have shown some openness in that sense, but time will tell, I guess.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much. I think you answered my question slightly, or you touched upon it, but I was wondering about the crisis being it's come about because of a lack of land or a lack of available land to build on, and perhaps restrictions on what land is available. I wonder if you just touch a little bit more on that.
Yeah, for example, I'm from Ecuador, so I used to live like 3 summers of my life when I was in high school in the Galapagos. And the Galapagos, which is also a subnational island jurisdiction, what they do, they have something called La Constitución, the Constitution, or it's like a special law that just applies in that island. So one of those laws, or that the Constitution has for those islanders, is that only if you were born in the Galapagos, you're able to own land. Other than that, you're not. So that, something like that, a variation of that, because now I think it's too late, could work. Or kind of like taking references from other subnational island jurisdictions, and also keeping in mind that that law was made or the way it started, it was because of the main islanders that lived there, and also they took into account people that were immigrants at the time in the Galapagos Islands. So including immigrants and all kinds of newcomers, not just international students, when it comes to policy making, I think it's something that we should look at when it comes to improving this issue or getting rid of this issue eventually.
Thank you. Now, Mo has opened that.
Okay. This actually is comments from our reviewing committee. You got 2 comments.
Yes.
One comment says it's a very good structured paper with a good literature references about housing crisis on small island. But at the same time, there is also an issue. This means the issues raised are island-specific one, or it also seems can be easily applied in other non-island peripheral communities. So how do you engage with them?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that last one.
So your finding seems not just island-based or Pacific.
Yeah.
So it seems also can be applied to other rural regions. So how do you plan to improve this issue?
On the island and other rural
So how do you make your finding more island-specific? Specific.
Island specific, not Pacific, because we're in the Atlantic. Okay. I think, like I mentioned, looking at other policies that have worked on other islands and when it comes to policy making, making that difference and acknowledging that the same policies that we use in the mainland will not work in the island context. I think that's one way to look at that. But it also could apply to rural communities because, for example, for Prince Edward Island, the seasonal economy is another big issue, which is what I'm looking at in my thesis at UPI, because a lot of the international students, aside from housing, they also keep leaving the island because of lack of meaningful job opportunities, which is not the case for Holland College students, which is really interesting, because if you have an education background, you are more likely to stay on the island. But if you don't, or maybe if you work in trades or in the tourism industry or the fishery industry or the agricultural industry, which is what sustains PEI's economy, that's when you stay. But if you don't, which is a lot of the majors that UPEI offers, for example, and a lot of the immigrants from PEI come through this program, being an international student. So that also tells you that how kind of not stable the economy is in this island. It could be the case for a lot of islands, because a lot of islands, for example, the Galapagos, 90% of their economy depends on tourism, and it's very seasonal. You only find summer jobs, and that also makes it difficult, and that's not the case for larger cities. So I think kind of acknowledging that there is a difference between islands and mainland, maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way, it could be the start of something, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborate. Okay, so I am going to talk about something I call local strategic development planning, and I think it has become the new black. You know, the popular phrase when something gets popular and a lot of people do it. In Denmark, local strategic development planning is becoming the new black. It's really popular, and we could analyze it as a kind of revitalization strategy. And Kirsten, you can hear me? Very good. All right. So what is local strategic development planning? Well, I wrote here that it's a planning project, basically, that aims at formulating strategies and projects to combat local depopulation. So in a sense, it's like a document that you produce when focusing on one location or one community, and then you identify different kinds of things we can do, projects, strategies, aiming at different themes that relate to a community. In this context, of course, island communities. But a local strategic development plan is also a process where you welcome the community into the decision room, in a sense. Historically, we can say that local planning in Denmark has always been a thing that came from the sky and fell down in the community. It was always the government, it was always bureaucrats, architects, and never local islanders or local inhabitants of wherever place it were. Okay, so the new thing here is that it's carried out by the community or members of the community. So it's from the bottom and up, in a sense. The area of research here is the 27 small islands in Denmark. They're the kind of islands that they cannot have more than 1,000 inhabitants, but really on average it would be somewhat like 200 inhabitants. So it's very small communities. Most often they only have one ferry service, one connecting service, and they will have, I don't know, 5 or 6 daily crossings and so on. Most of them do not have schools anymore, so very little communities. And this is a desk research project, basically, because I have not done interviews like I actually wanted to test these plans. I have only read the plans and then visited the Statistical Bureau in Denmark afterwards to see how did it go. Could they combat the population decline by formulating strategies among the islanders themselves? And a theory that I suggest that we can talk about when we try to understand this locally oriented, locally based planning is the Robert Sampson urban theoretical idea of collective efficacy. It's not directly collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is the idea that behavior in a community is uniformed in a sense. So different communities will start being small mosaics where people act in the same direction, and even in schools they will, kids from one neighborhood will have the same grades, kids from another community will have different grades and so on. On neighborhood level you can divide the population in many areas where they have a lot of things in common. And Robert Sampson thinks that this is collective efficacy, that there are something bigger than the individual in these communities that affect how people act and so on. And in a sense, to dream of the future, to have a plan for how will my island survive, is also a kind of collective efficacy, because we can see that when people move to an island, very quickly they become a part of this movement. LSDPs, local strategic development plans, are a formalized version of this collective efficacy in this sense. But it's still kind of a stretch. It's from urban theory. So a quick word on organizational, the organization of small island administrations. You can see in the top of the model we have the state. The state is the primary financer of islands, sustaining islands, developing islands, and so on. Under the state we have the municipal government, and they are the direct agency that works together with the island communities, or the small island communities. And then we have in the bottom the islands, and in the top of the island community we have the local board or the local association and so on. They are the organized islanders and so on. And a LSDP is situated somewhere between the local board or the local association and then the municipal government. You cannot go to the state with a document like that. You cannot go to the state with a plan like that. It's primarily aimed at the local municipality. So what exactly is LSDPs? It's a process where you define a vision for your community and then formulate strategies or action to get there. In almost any LSDP I have studied, and I wrote in my abstract that it would be around 10 LSDPs, I ended up studying 25 of them. All of them have this goal that we want more inhabitants in the future. So that's interesting. It's a common understanding among not 27 but 22 or 21 small island communities in Denmark that we are in big troubles. We need more inhabitants. Okay, so quick mention on the process. The project will start somehow. A leading group will take the initiative and they will have found some funding sources. Then they hire an external consultant to do the reading, do the analysis, do the printing of the plan. And then there will be town hall meetings and workshops and lectures, and most interestingly, thematic work groups where you recruit in the local community different members that want to formulate strategies on ferries, on housing, on tourism, and so on and so on. So that's another quite interesting thing, that all these islanders formulate the same goals. We can say islands have something in common. That's not very controversial to say in this room at an island conference. but really they identify the same problems in all of these plans. So that's interesting, and not because they read each other plans, because it's a really boring read. So it's not like they are affecting each other. So here is a bit on the development of these plans. The blue chart is the population decline in small islands in Denmark, and we can see that since the 40s, the population has halved in Denmark among the small islands. And we can also see that in the last 20 years, the usage of local planning has skyrocketed. It drops a bit in the end, and it's because that I am not able to say from 2020 to 2030 so many plans have been made. But already by now, from 2020 to 2023, 14 plans have been made on a number of small islands. So by the end of this decade, it will be going upwards, the chart on how much do we use this. I can see I'm quite in a pickle with time here, so I will hurry up. Another thing,
6 minutes.
6 minutes, very good, okay. Another thing that's interesting is the production of local development. LSDPs, which in a sense I could recommend other islands in the world to do this, to abandon the state thinking and use the community as the experts on what we need to do and so on. A thing I will warn you about is that it is also becoming a market. To be a consultant and go into this field is becoming a market. We can see here on the chart that small private consultants of the past have been taken over by big consultancy firms in Denmark. Some of them are even international, but it's quite interesting how they have targeted such a small audience. I mean, 5,000 inhabitants, that's a very, very small market. But there's money to be made, so they have gotten into the market. And I have brought two cases. One is from 2010. Back then, the budget of a local plan was $13,000, around $13,000. Today, in 2023, the value has increased, as you can see. It's the same as 1 million Danish cash today. So that is the value, and a large amount of that value will go into the pockets of the consultants. So that's another reason why we see this rise in big companies going in here. So just a quick glance at a plan from 2010. It is pretty handheld. You can see it's not even a file on a computer anymore. It has been scanned. It's a small private consultant that have made this plan. And today a plan looks more like this. It is done beautifully. The production value is quite high. So very quick on the success rate. As we can see, all the red numbers are loss of inhabitants on different islands where they had a strategic plan, an LSDP. Clearly we can see that it's not very effectively in stabilizing or gaining population in these very small communities. So I can say it has no documented effect. Of course, we cannot take the newest plans and say how have it changed, because you cannot evaluate a plan in 1 year or a half year or 2 years. It doesn't make sense. And I think I should move on really to get to the most important point, but there are some merits to these plans. They are great at starting physical projects where the community co-owns a formerly private institution. It could be a school, it could be a city hall or something like that went bankrupt or whatever happened. These plans are great at uniting people in some very small projects that secure, for instance, buildings on an island for a specific purpose, a commonly owned grocery store and so on. But here is what I really want to to say. While the municipal governments are supporting the usage of LSDPs as an expression of wanting to do something for these island communities, we see great welfare cut downs on ferries, on schools, on healthcare, and what did I mention? They will not work with sanctioning illegal second home owning. So really what we see here is municipal governments moving away from the small islands, while at the same time encouraging the small islands to be the inventor of their future. It is important for me to say that LSDPs are interesting. They can create or utilize social capital, but they cannot unmake the problem with centralization and cutting down welfare services, like removing ferries. And you cannot make that up as an islander. You cannot invent your own solution in that sense, because it's a matter of welfare and being attached to the welfare grid. I think I have used pretty much.
1 minute, 20 seconds.
Oh, I have some more? Okay, very good. That's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Then I would like to go back for a minute. You know, it's really interesting how that LSDPs can create or reinforce a common understanding of needs and action among islanders in the community. In that sense, it's a great tool for making political awareness on a very local level. In that sense, it's very interesting. But it's just important for me to tell you this before anyone comes and asks. You know, back in the, I don't know, 70s or 80s, it was Danes who taught the Irish how to organize small islands. We were first among the nations with a small island association with direct contact to the state. So before you come to us, any of you, and want to learn, I will warn you that these are not perfect. These are great at rallying the community to common action and common reflection on what do we need, but they cannot make up for welfare and dimensions within the welfare that will always be a welfare issue, such as ferries in Denmark. I know that there are also private companies here in Japan, but in Denmark it's purely a public domain. Yeah. So maybe I should conclude my presentation here. Yeah, thank you. So, any questions? I have.
Oh, okay.
Yes, please.
Oh, you can go first.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a great presentation, and actually on the topic of translocating policy, it made me really think about like something that has been written about Japan about 10 years ago. So Japan also had all this, or still has all these so-called machizukuri, like efforts and policies. So basically it means place making or town making, which are kind of similar to what has, not the same, but similar to what is being done here. And I remember this paper was saying that, okay, but then is this, okay, you give the community's responsibility over their own future and their own development, which in a sense is good. It's not the central government deciding everything, but then at the same time you give these already depleted communities who are depopulating and aging the responsibility to somehow revitalize themselves, although they might not have the energy to do so, because like even from a human resource perspective, they don't have this kind of energy. So is this a positive thing, or is that more what a kind of a neoliberal devolvement of responsibility, just telling the communities, okay, you just do it by yourself? Because then we have, again, as you pointed out in your case, and this is the same for Japan, you have these welfare cuts to peripheral and marginal communities, which are very real. And how can communities revitalize themselves from the inside while like services are being cut? There are no ferries, there are no schools, there are no hospitals. So again, this becomes an issue of how do we balance this, because the Japanese government is going in the same direction of getting local government to manage themselves, but to what extent this is a good thing or a bad thing, it's quite an open question. And I felt a strong similarity with Japan in this case you presented, so thank you very much. That was just a comment, not a question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when you go back in time and see the earliest LSDPs, and again we can call them whatever you like, it's not a fixed term really, but when we go back in time we see these much handheld plans. They are very, they look like it's done by a local basically. You get that feeling. In that sense, the professional consultants that are moving into this market disguise them as highly professional things, which could give the misperception that this is feasible, these are good projects and so on, but they will still reflect either a active and wise community or an exhausted community with a lot of old people who have no idea how they should attract young people from the creative class and so on and so on. So it's definitely a problem, I'll give you that. But already now there is this segregational pattern in Denmark where we see a few rural areas and a few small islands among all these 27 small islands that are harvesting a lot of newcomers, while the rest of the small islands do not get very many newcomers. And of course those islands are interesting to see how there is a qualitative difference between these LSDPs based on the collective wisdom of the communities. Yeah.
And as a follow-up of this, because I found interesting that you use this theory of collective efficacy, which I don't really know, but I thought it was interesting, like could that explain like the difference we see like between islands that are successful in attracting these migrants and islands that are failing at doing so, or not just attracting migrants but at somehow revitalizing themselves in some way?
Yeah, I think in general the segregationist, or not the segregation, the segregation as a theory can help us explain this, and collective efficacy can help us explain why in all the islands with a lot of newcomers, they are much more interested in green transitioning projects, and they are a lot better at attracting newcomers and so on than in the other islands. So in that sense, I think it can explain if we allow ourselves to annex urban theory, of course. That's also a little controversial here in Island Studies Forum.
Christian has
oh yeah. How do I? Okay.
Oh, I can just speak if you want.
Yeah, very good. All right.
So I'm really interested. We have quite a similar thing called community action plans here in Scotland, and they can really reflect what is required on a local level. However, when we see government policy kind of created either at a regional level or at the Scottish government level, they seem to ignore these community action plans. So things like 20-minute neighbourhoods, the ability to be able to access everything you need within 20 minutes is not a policy that it can be applied to, for example, the island I live in. And so we're seeing this disconnect between these community action plans and actual policy that's being developed on a regional and national level. So I'm wondering if that's the same situation in Denmark, or whether anybody kind of further up the food chain is taking these community action plans into account with higher level policy.
Well, I think it's the same case in Denmark, that there are no dialogue between a finalized LSDP and then either the local municipal government, or the state. Now it becomes a bit anecdotal, but some years back I contributed to an LSDP in my home island, and it was an LSDP that combined 3 islands in the same municipal area, and the local government went really far, going outside of the medias with pushing the LSDP away from them during the process. They were very clear on this will not be politically acknowledged. The projects you are proposing we will not be committed to help you with getting more ferries per day, for instance, or more daily crossings. And that's interesting, while at the same time they go out in the media and are bragging about having supported economically this process and saying, you can see, we are a great island municipality, we support these small islands. So there is a conflicting signals here in a sense. And so it's completely the same, I will say, but I got a really ugly look into the municipal machinery in that sense. So it's more anecdotal than analytical what I can add on that. Yeah. But thank you for your question, Kirsten. So. All right, then we will, and thank you everyone. Now we will move on to the last presentation. I would like to present Kirsten Gow, who are with us from Scotland, and I think it is, welcome to Kirsten.
Yes, pass the space. Thank you.
Maiden Gow for Alaba. Good morning from Scotland, and thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Kirsten Gow, and today I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about my PhD research mapping the Scottish Islands diaspora. I'll be looking at the shape of the diaspora and its connections to the islands, and looking at how this might be an important area to explore when thinking about island repopulation. Historically, the concept of diaspora has been associated with the dispersion of the Jewish peoples, although it is not uncommon nowadays to hear the term associated with national identities, such as the Irish diaspora. The term, however, remains a contested one. Skelton and Bastia provide a relatively narrow definition of a diaspora, including only groups of people living outside their countries of birth who continue to identify with each other based on shared, usually national identities. However, this doesn't quite fit with cultural diasporas, which, as Nagel and Boyle point out, can span multiple locales while maintaining a degree of cohesiveness across time and space through a range of practices. This definition does include the potential of a homeland, though is less prescriptive about individuals needing to have resided there. More widely, the concept of diaspora has begun to be applied by some to groups without shared territorial history. Concepts such as the queer diaspora instead focus on the commonality in identity and often cultural practices associated with definable groups. The question of who qualifies to be part of any diaspora and what form a diaspora takes can therefore be relatively nebulous. Several academics have noted that diasporan status can be allocated and inherited, with some definitions going even further. In 2009, Andersen et al. Highlighted what they call the affinity diaspora as part of a publication by the Scottish Government. This group is defined as a collection of people, usually former immigrants and tourists or business travellers, who have a different national or ethnic identity to a nation state, but who feel some special affinity or affection to that nation state, and who act on its behalf. In discussions around diaspora, it's also important to note the relatively recent rise of the nation state, as well as differing perspectives on territorialisation and differences between national and ethnographic mapping. While diaspora is often defined against the borders created by modern nations, this can fail to take into account the spatiality of cultures, which might be more accurately mapped using ethnographic mapping. This can include cultures which transcend modern-day national borders, such as the Sami people, and distinct cultures which exist within modern-day nations. It is within this context that my PhD explores diaspora relationships and return migration from the perspective of the Scottish Islands. My research aims to explore the potential for those with connections to Scotland's islands to contribute to sustainable island futures, particularly via return migration. In doing so, my research supports Strategic Objective 1 of the Scottish Government's National Island Plan, which is to address population decline and ensure healthy, balanced population profiles. It also complements wider work by colleagues at the James Hutton Institute, including work on sparsely populated areas, island resilience, and the National Islands Plan Survey. As a human geographer, I always have to be mindful of my own positionality, and it's important to note that my research is undertaken in the context of me living in an island as a return migrant. In the broad context, I take a post-colonial missiological approach, which encourages the study of islands on their own terms, respecting the knowledge they hold and working from an island-centred perspective. So why is it important to think about the diaspora in this context? There is a range of literature out there citing the importance of financial remittances in diaspora relationships. This mainly focuses on the idea of a migrant worker sending money home. And while sending money to family might be less relevant in a Scottish Islands context, there are potential comparisons to be drawn between the type of support discussed by Nagel and Boyle in their exploration of Mexican hometown associations and diaspora activity in Scotland. This includes the Colonsay Housing Project's recent crowdfunding campaign, which raised over £30,000 to help fund affordable housing in the island. If they were solely relying on their resident population of 124 people, this would have been a challenging target. But using their diaspora connections, the original target was actually exceeded. It's important to recognise that this is not only a potential source of financial investment for local development. These investors are also stakeholders who can and do have influence in developments in the community. That support and influence can also come in the form of other investments. For example, the investment of time and expertise as a volunteer in a community. Among islands with small populations, many local development organisations actively encourage participation from volunteer board members who are not permanently based in an island. Often this is a necessity due to the fact they have limited human capital available within the resident population. An understanding of the diaspora in terms of migration and population is also important. Firstly, the loss of young people from the islands is well documented. While some of this population decline might be tackled by encouraging young people to stay, there also needs to be a recognition that leaving to explore different opportunities and personal identity could be a natural part of the life course. This means it's likely to always be the case that some young people leave. That does not have to mean that they're gone forever, and so understanding the continued connection they have to the island and their islander identity can help us understand if and where there is potential for return. This potential return can assist repopulation of the islands, but it's not just about numbers of people who return. Research has already identified that local knowledge and social capital can be key elements of building resilience in rural communities. While all migrants potentially bring benefit to the community, those with long-term connections to the islands they move to are likely to have greater amounts of local knowledge and established social capital than those migrants with no connection. Finally, the diaspora population is also worth considering in terms of wider mobilities, including circulation and heterolocality. Last year, a Scottish Government report looking at the lessons that we can learn from approaches to tackling depopulation in islands in Japan identified potential opportunities to connect with the Kankijinku, roughly translated as the relationship population. This included making efforts to encourage members of the diaspora to consider setting up businesses in satellite offices in island communities, even if this is only on a part-time basis. As well as acknowledging the importance of diaspora populations in the islands, this suggestion also recognises the potential of utilising wider mobility patterns in development planning. Little research currently exists on the Scottish Islands diaspora, and therefore in order to get an understanding of the shape of the diaspora and the connections they have to each other and the islands, I first carried out an online survey. The survey ran in late 2022 and gathered data on personal characteristics, current circumstances, continued connection to the islands, activity within the diaspora community, and return migration aspirations. This resulted in 505 completed responses covering 49 Scottish islands ranging in size and type. Right now, I'm following up this survey with a number of focus groups to tease out some of the data gathered a little bit more. Responses to the survey came from a wide range of age groups. Responses from women made up 62% of the data, which could be attributed to a greater interest among women in responding to research of this kind, but might also reflect differences between genders in terms of patterns of migration from origin islands. 68% of respondents lived in mainland Scotland at the time of the survey, with a further 18% living in the rest of the UK. Overseas respondents came from a range of countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and Oceania. I'm only just starting out with the full analysis of the results of the survey, but there are already some areas worthy of note. Firstly, a large proportion of respondents reported interactions with other islanders in off-island locations. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this includes socialising with people they knew from their own island in their new location. But it also covers wider interactions not much discussed in previous research. This includes attending venues, events, and clubs which they specifically associate with the islands, including specific pubs, churches, music events, and sports clubs. Early indications from follow-up focus groups indicate that language and music play an important part in the attraction of these spaces. However, participants also acknowledge and value these as island spaces where individuals can find and interact with other islanders. Interaction with other islanders can be seen both in these spaces and through direct socialisation with friends from other islands. Once again, when this was explored more in focus group, participants widely acknowledged that their identity as an islander was not simply related to the island or islands they had personal connections with. Instead, there was a sharing of common identity, not limited to language or location. This allows for the conceptualization of an island's diaspora rather than just multiple island diasporas. Respondents reported high levels of connections to their islands using various means. This included high levels of contact with people who still live in the island, with 40% of respondents being in contact with those in the island on a daily basis, and a further 32% in contact at least once a week. By a small margin, social media was the most popular means of keeping up to date with what was actually happening on the island. This highlights how social media could be an interesting area for those of us exploring islands diasporas. For example, in my island, we have a permanent population of around 250 people, but a community Facebook group with just under 2,000 members at the time of writing this presentation. Regardless of the technical developments of the last 15 to 20 years, however, those in the diaspora still rely heavily on personal contact with those living in the island to keep up to date with what is happening there. Local media sources used to keep up to date range from websites of local newspapers to more small-scale newsletters, which are distributed in some islands and sent out to those in the diaspora. Many respondents to the survey also indicated that they continue to maintain social networks on the islands through attendance at community events and social events. Yet the diaspora are not necessarily simply passive consumers of island news and culture. A small proportion of respondents to the survey also indicated that they continue to participate in wider community life on the island through actions such as volunteering for the community, helping out at island events, fundraising for local causes, attending meetings about community issues, and responding to consultations which affect the island. Although these percentages are relatively small, we should remember that many of the islands included within this study have very small populations themselves, with limited capacity to deliver activities on island, or to advocate for their needs in the wider world. Access to people in the diaspora who have the time and expertise to help out with these areas might not just be beneficial to some islands, it might actually be crucial for their day-to-day functioning. But the diaspora also has potential to contribute to island communities in terms of return migration. Those responding to my survey were asked about their aspirations or otherwise for return, with 65% indicating that they potentially have a desire to move back to an island. This was split between those who definitely want to return and those who might want to return, and further broken down into short and long-term aspirations. You can see here that people who might want to return in the long term are actually the largest group within the sample. Given that tackling long-term depopulation needs long-term planning, it is worth noting that these aspirations, with a view to trying to understand what actions need to be taken to increase the small percentage of people who actively plan making a return. I'm still in the early stages of the analysis of the survey data. However, I've been able to run some tests of difference to look at aspirations for return against wider characteristics of the sample. From the initial results, it looks as though respondents who have aspirations of return are significantly more likely to be in contact with those already resident in the island than those who have no desire to move. They're also significantly more likely to be involved in on-island activity, such as volunteering or fundraising. The desire to return appears to be the strongest in the years immediately following people moving away. However, it is weakest for people who have lived away from the island from 3 to 5 years. Age also affects aspirations of return, with the desire to return peaking in respondents between the ages of 25 and 44 and falling steadily over the following decades. I still have more analysis to conduct, but ultimately my hope is that the data gathered through this research can help us understand the potential contribution the island's diaspora can make to the future of Scotland's islands, including via return migration. It can also help us understand the challenges in realising this potential in order to create better policy interventions and build sustainable futures for our islands. Here are my references, which I'm happy to share with you all. I just want to thank you for having me here today. Sorry I can't be here in person, but hopefully I will be answering questions shortly.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Yeah, and now we are opening the floor for questions. So maybe if you have a question, could you perhaps come up here, because otherwise we will have to repeat the questions.
Very simple question.
Very simple question from Mo.
So you have one slide of data mentioned about the community events and social events. They are both quite high. What are the differences among these two?
So I was thinking when I created the survey, I was thinking about what I used to do when I was in the island's diaspora. I lived off the island for a while, and what people do now. And I was trying to make a differentiation between there about just socialising with friends. So a community, I'm just getting the slide here. Another social event on the island could be, for example, you're attending a birthday party or an anniversary party, or you've gone back for a specific event within your friendship group. Whereas the community events are much more you're more likely to interact with the wider community. So it's slightly two different audiences of people that you may be interacting with them. And there was a little bit of nuance between the two in the responses. So I think there was a little bit of a recognition there that, that actually the social side of things and community side of things can be slightly different groups of people that you're interacting with.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, Kirsten. I have a question, and feel free to come up here and ask. Valja also I have a maybe quick question. I wonder what is preventing these diaspora exiled islanders in coming back. My favorite Danish author, Martin A. Hansen, wrote in his classical work, The Liar. It's a novel which takes place on a fictional Danish island. He wrote that it is spirit to work the land and study it, and it is not spirit but a sin to steal in the beauties of an island. Meaning that if you're serious, if you really want to do something good for your island, then you either have to live there and become a farmer or study it. But only going back during your vacation in the summer or at Christmas and enjoying it when it's comfortable and easy is not okay, according to him. So my question is, how much do we need to fix on a structural level
in regards of housing and work and all we have been discussing today, and how much is it that we need to change the culture to make exiled islanders feel obligated morally to come home and be the next generation? Can we do that in a sense?
Okay, so actually it ties in with a question that I think Luke was asked earlier about, can we fix this with policy, the depopulation side of things. And depopulation of the islands is affected by policy, but actually it's also affected by island culture. And what we have to remember is that islanders have been highly mobile throughout history. The sea is literally right there. It's part of the daily life. So traveling between islands, traveling kind of beyond our islands, joining things like the merchant navy, going away to find different experience. That is part of the culture. And I think it's really important to recognise that, because sometimes I think there is a little bit of a taboo with some people about you can't talk about leaving because that's the bad thing. And actually it's not a bad thing. It's part of the natural life course for a lot of people. Now if you're leaving because you have to and you don't want to leave, or if you're leaving because there aren't the opportunities that would allow you to stay, that is a different thing entirely. So there are some people in the diaspora that I'm speaking to who are actually it's about the life course. It's about meeting a partner or being in the place that they want to be, or doing a job that literally can't be done in the islands because it's based very physically somewhere else. But there are certainly things that need to be addressed in order to make to allow people to even consider to come back to the islands. We have a huge issue with ferries over here at the moment in terms of I won't go into it, but it's a huge political issue that has actually reached like Westminster, which a lot of little island things don't reach Westminster, and it has reached the national press. So that on top of the housing crisis, which is very real here, the only way I can afford to live back here is by co-owning a house with my mother, which was not my plan in my 40s, so on top of all of those things, it's kind of difficult. So there's always going to be a proportion of people who leave, and that's why we're always going to need migration from various sources. But actually, if you want to encourage those people to come back and stay, there's a huge amount of there are some very key infrastructural things that need to be changed in order to allow that.
Thank you. And now Valia has a question.
I think you stole half of my question. But
sorry, apologies.
Meeting brains here, talking the same things for 2 days. You surveyed all these people, and about 60% had an aspirational sort of desire to one day come back to the island. But further down, you said that only 3 actually had actual plans. In your survey, did they provide any reasons other than the obvious that we have been discussing here, infrastructure and why they're not moving from the aspirational to the actual plan?
Yeah, sure. So they didn't in the survey. So yeah, the survey was split down into kind of 5 groups. So there are those people that either might or definitely want to return in the short term, and might or definitely want to return in the long term. And then the people who are actively making plans, 6 groups, because then there's also the group that no, don't ever want to come home. That wasn't explored in the survey, but it's been explored in the follow-up focus groups that I've been running. And so there's some really interesting things that have come out. And so some of it is about jobs, although the impact of COVID, we've had people saying, well, actually, I technically could do my job from the island now, is an interesting one. Families and partners play a strong role in that as well, which is pretty well documented in migration literature. But interestingly, 2 really interesting things that came up in that was actually a partner who is from the same archipelago, but from a different island, and the question about, but if we move back, which island would we go to? Because that's quite a big thing as well. And then also the idea of adult children living in the mainland and you returning. There was one participant who talked about the fact that when they last lived on the island, their mother had a fall and was helicoptered out to hospital, flown out to hospital, but there was a storm and they couldn't leave the island themselves for 3 days. And their mother eventually died in hospital. And she talked about how that was incredibly, difficult for her. And actually, with her grown-up children living in the mainland now, the thought of that distance, that difficulty of crossing that stretch of water, which at that time was about the weather, but actually has been exacerbated by the various crises here, was kind of too much. So relationships, life course, where I am right now, the people that talk about it in the long term, it's a bit like, I kind of would in the future, but right now I'm kind of happy doing what I'm doing and I'm kind of settled here. So there are a variety of factors that affect it, but the traditional ones of kind of relationships and kind of life course and the ability to enact the things that you want to be enacting in your daily life are the main ones that really feed into that.
So Scotland had this major diaspora engagement strategy not long ago, right? I read somewhere that like 40 million Scots living somewhere around the world, including in Aotearoa, where I live.
We get everywhere,
Yeah. You're famous, you're good for that. So my question here is because, in the Pacific, for instance, we have a lot of islanders living in Aotearoa and they form transnational communities. And there is that intangible island they carry with them, like the Cook Islanders, the Tongans. The Tongans have one online newspaper, Tāmi o Tonga, and they read it every day from Aotearoa, and they're engaging in politics, elections, the whole lot. So is there another way to engage with your island as a diasporic islander that is equal, as good as, why do we have to bring the islanders back? That's what I'm saying, and I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, no, 100%. So actually, that brings up a really interesting point, is the strength of the ability to interact with other people in the diaspora. Is that one of the things that keeps people away from islands? Is it the fact that we have this really strong diaspora? You can still feed your islander identity by going to the pubs in Glasgow that are colloquially known as the Chip the Triangle, and Chip was a derogatory word for somebody from the Highlands and Islands that's been reclaimed, but there are 3 pubs in the West End of Glasgow called the Chip the Triangle, where the islanders go and island music is played. And there was a big festival in Glasgow last weekend, which was a Chip the Festival, with all of the traditional music being played, and people acknowledged that there are certain music gigs or churches and things that you will go to and you will meet islanders. And the one other thing I want to mention here, because I find it absolutely fascinating, it's the West Coast Islands, it's not the Northern Isles, but the islands on the West Coast, many of them have these things called island associations. So, for example, we have a Glasgow Jura Association, or there's a Glasgow Coal Association. It's generally Glasgow because that's where most of the migrants from islands went to. And these were established in the late 1800s to kind of support people coming from the islands into the city to take up work during the Industrial Revolution. And actually they became ways to support each other kind of in practical ways, in terms of offering places to live and jobs and money, financial support, but also in cultural ways too. And those associations have exist to this day, and there are these things called gatherings, which you either know about or you don't. And once a year, islanders from Jura go to the mainland and they congregate in the Triangle, and they meet up with all of the other people that live in Glasgow that are associated with Jura, and this is a multi-generational thing. And we go to the pub and we have a dance and we eat food together, and this happens across Ireland. So I think it's a really interesting thing that there are lots of ways for people to continue to interact with their islander identity, both on a large scale and on a specific island scale. And that's only increasing with the increase in kind of Facebook groups and things like that people can do this online now. And that may be one of the things that you kind of have to counteract a little bit if you're trying to say, no, come back, we need you here. So yeah, it's a bit of a weighing up, really.
Definitely.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.